Hi, everyone. My name is Norma Nieto, and I'll be facilitating our Establish a Cloud Center of Excellence in Azure webinar tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded, and the download link to the recording will be shared with you afterwards. Second, we will have live Q&A at the end with our presenters. To ask a question, please use the question feature on your GoToWebinar control panel. Usually it can be found at the right side of the screen. You can use the question feature during the presentation as well if any questions arise while you're watching. For any questions we run out of time on today in our live session, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the session. Now, I'd like to get started by introducing our wonderful presenters for the day. First up, we have Mike Snell, who's our VP of Solutions Delivery here at CEI. He has over 25 years of experience leading our teams to create software that clients love, and he has led our group for over 18 years. He's a recognized thought leader and has led his team in the successful delivery of projects in nearly every industry using every technology out there. Mike is also a published author. He has written 8 books, including the Visual Studio Unleashed series and various Microsoft training kits. Our main presenter today is Jeff Tewksbury. He's the principal architect here at CEI and our Azure thought leader. He's responsible for leading both onshore and offshore teams on very large, complex engagements, including technologies, of course, such as Microsoft Azure, SharePoint, Windows 8, and mobile solutions. He has over 16 years of experience overall, and he is a Microsoft certified architect developer, a certified Scrum Master, and holds certifications as a Microsoft Partner Technology Solutions Professional in Cloud and Azure. And certainly last but not least is Sandy Barrett, who's our VP of Strategic Alliances here at CEI. He helps us work through our strategic partnerships to help bring our clients successful enterprise solutions. Before I turn it over to Mike to get started, just real quick, going through the agenda. Obviously, we did our presenters. Mike will provide an introduction overall to the themes that we're going to talk about today. And then we'll turn it over to Jeff to do our the main body of the presentation. Sandy will walk us through a case study, tell you about how we can help you, and a little bit about CEI, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. Okay, take it away, Mike.
All right, thank you, Norma. We'd like to go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Norma, we can go ahead one slide. So what I want to do is introduce the cloud, our Cloud Center of Excellence and Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework. But before I do, I want to just talk a little bit about why people are moving to the cloud en masse, right? So some of the motivations for adopting cloud technologies have been over time, 1, migrations, and 2, innovations, right? So on the migration side, this is where we're doing things like lift and shift, or you've heard the term maybe lift and shine, where you're taking your existing workloads and driving them up into the cloud so that you can reduce some of the complexities of hosting them in your own data centers. You can leverage cost savings at scale. You can increase your ability to scale the applications, as well as fault tolerance and disaster recovery and things like that. And then as we move in towards innovation, this is leveraging a lot of the services that are built in the cloud to help improve the way we interact with customers, help us transform our products with machine learning and AI and other services that are available to us, and really create new products that don't currently exist within an organization, right? So these 2 big paths have been instrumental in helping customers as they adopt the cloud. However, we do see that the customers face a challenge here, right? And so the challenge is, how do we enable scaled migration and rapid innovation while maintaining standards and tracking to established budgets? So what we've seen over time is that we start moving these things in the cloud, and then there's not enough prescriptive guidance. There's not enough there's a lot of capabilities out there, and customers are confused by some of the pricing. They don't know where the pricing belongs and things like that. And so if you've ever moved to the cloud and you've experienced some of these challenges, we're going to tell you how establishing a Cloud Center of Excellence can really help you through those challenges. Go ahead, Norma. So what we wanted to introduce first was a set of products and really sort of a thought process around what Microsoft calls the Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF. And what this is it brings together people, process, and technologies to establish governance about how your company views the cloud, right? So this enables people to help create innovation or unlock innovation by delivering approved templates, documentation, best practices, and baking that into the pieces that you're going to be providing to the organization. And then the organization gets that governance by default, right? And that really helps you achieve the balance across a set of best practices while sort of enabling people to self-service and take advantage of the cloud in ways that are natural to them, versus having to go through things like governance bodies and things like that. Instead, the governance should just be baked in and allow you to innovate fast, and then we can track things like costs and things like that. Go ahead, Norma. So as mentioned, these cloud technologies, Azure in specific, they're large, powerful platforms. There's a lot of capabilities in there. That power can be daunting. It can be overwhelming. It can often be misused, and when it's misused, it can often be hyper expensive for the wrong reasons, right? And so we want to make sure that as a company, we establish what we call a Cloud Center of Excellence. And the Cloud Center of Excellence brings together a set of features that help organizations not just define standards, but enact those standards, establish that governance, and then monitor what's capable. And you think about it like this too: is as a customer, I want to know how we view the cloud and how we establish our standards, and make sure that's baked into what we do every day. And so you can even take this as far as training, and some of the training is baked into the tools, and you can almost even think of it, I want to be certified to do cloud at my company versus just certified in Azure, which is a very large platform, if you will. Go ahead, one click there, Norma. So as we think about some of the things that we want to establish governance on, right? And one of them always, that comes top of mind, right, is cost savings and controlling budgets. And we want to be able to track those budgets back to the actual workloads. We want to make sure that we're getting the value out of the monies we're spending, and that we're actually using the services that we've got, and if there are better services that we can be using, right? Another item there is increased agility. We don't want to think of governance as this heavy-handed thing that put shackles on our teams. Instead, it should do the opposite, right? Through templates and blueprints and baked-in best practices, it should enable these teams to get at the business of building the software that meets the needs of the business, versus having to worry about did I check every box on our compliance piece for our infrastructure, right? We want to make sure that companies understand their needs and compliance around global access to their environments, as well as data sovereignty. And then, of course, we want to reduce cycle times to production. We want to make sure we have high performance in disaster recovery. And then security is always a big thing, and compliance goes hand in hand with that. So as a result, Microsoft has created a few products that Jeff's going to talk about here in just a second that help really enable all of these governance and innovation pieces to happen in a controlled environment. So one of them being Azure Policy to help self-service provisioning of infrastructure. Another one is managing groups, through Azure Group Management to create hierarchies and around subscriptions. Another is Azure Graph or Azure Resource Graph to allow you to visualize your workloads and see what's happening within your environments. And then, of course, blueprints help with your compliance and proactively control that consistency across various implementations. And last but not least, of course, is the Azure Cost Management tool, which really helps companies optimize their cloud spend. So with that, I will hand it over to Jeff to go a little bit deeper on some of these technologies. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. Next slide, Norma, if you don't mind. So when we talk about cloud center of excellence, and Mike touched upon a number of these, but one of the things to think about is that in any IT organization, we kind of see two competing forces, right? So we have our DevOps teams and our development teams, and their real desire is for enablement. They want to be able to move quickly. They want to be able to deliver new features for their customers. But we also have, as a counterpart to that, the need for governance and for control. And those two sometimes are challenging to do both at the same time. And that really is the goal, the overall goal of a CCOE, is to be able to establish that balance between formalized governance, but while still allowing for those DevOps teams to work effectively and efficiently. And when we look at the Cloud Center of Excellence, we break it down into a few kind of categories and responsibilities. Really, we see Cloud Center of Excellence as providing a platform back to the organization, a cloud platform back to the organization. Obviously, Azure, is, as Mike said, is a complicated, big space. And we want to make sure that we are establishing our organizational standards and practices, and that those are curated and fostered back to the organization. So if we look at some of these major categories, organizational cloud service provider, one of the first things that we typically recommend organizations consider, whether or not they're in the cloud today or whether or not they're just starting out, is to really take a strong look at their IT organization and match their Azure account structure and subscription structure to that IT organization. And we're going to talk about that a little more here in a few slides. But that really is a foundational building block for how you can build up a cloud environment that can adapt with your organization over time. But let's also think about some scenarios where we want to be able to provide services back to our customers, our users of the cloud platform within our organization. One of the ones that Mike talked about, which is often challenging for customers, is self-service cost reporting. We want to build a structure that can be used so that people can very easily within the organization, whether or not these are people that are looking at the entire cloud environment overall, or whether or not these are people who are responsible for particular solutions or segments of that cloud environment, can get very detailed analytics in terms of their spend, and can even help them set up spending budgets and things like that so they can be notified if they're starting to reach certain thresholds. Self-service usage statistics. How can we help to service back to consumers of our cloud environment that they are using, that they're right size, right? That the scale that they're using things on, whether or not they're talking about VM scale sets or maybe Azure SQL database tiers and things like that, how can we ensure that they have knowledge in terms of whether or not they're making the most effective use of the resources that they have? Solution management, deployment, obviously, but also monitoring. So how can we ensure that we as an organization are providing out not just Azure where they can go and roll their own solution for monitoring, but how can we ensure that they're following an organizational monitoring pattern so that, again, different levels of the organization can have visibility into different areas of that environment, and even tying back into instant reporting systems that they might be using. Another main focus area for the CCOE that we see is a trusted cloud advisor and cloud vendor manager. So helping to work with the organization to be able to procure and manage cloud vendor certification. So we have people who are going to be spun up on new BI projects and new AI projects. How do we ensure that we have a team that can actually help to assist with the certification process so that those individuals have the training they need? Organizational specific cloud mentoring. That's where Mike mentioned, you can even go a step beyond that. And it's not just you're certified in, say, Azure, but you're certified in Azure for your organization and the way that your organization employs it. Conducting well-architected reviews. So for tier 1 solutions that have maybe very stringent regulatory, security, or even high availability requirements, making sure that you have a team there that has expertise that can help guide and maybe provide recommendations as those teams are working through their architectural decision-making process. Interfacing with cloud vendors for additional support when needed. Oftentimes, there's a lot of different teams that are working across organizations, especially large enterprise organizations. They don't necessarily have all the inroads to, say, Microsoft professionals and things like that they might want to use if they're facing certain problems or certain challenges. So having a way that they can interface with them through that CCOE becomes important. And obviously, across all those areas, providing thought leadership. And lastly, curating cloud standards and practices. And this is an area where, I see organizations sometimes maybe going down a track which maybe isn't optimal. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's a central body that is simply defining all the standards and pushing them out in somewhat of a dictatorial fashion. This really means that you're allowing the team to organically work through their cloud environment, and you're curating the learnings across those organizations and those different teams, and you're starting to bake those back into the organization so that others can benefit from where other people have gained success. Next slide, if you don't mind, Norma. So Mike has introduced us to the cloud adoption framework, and I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail. Like Mike said, it's really a collection of best practices, guidance, and tools that help to structure and accelerate strategic cloud adoption. It's an iterative process. You see here that going planning, ready, and adopt, this is a constant cycle, right? Your cloud journey is never done, fortunately or unfortunately. As the cloud evolves and as your organization evolves, you're going to constantly have to reevaluate new opportunities in the cloud and new solutions that you want to deploy within it. And it is important to note, for our AWS and GCP friends, while we are focused on this presentation on Azure, AWS has their own variation of the cloud adoption framework. GCP has what they call RAMP, which is the Rapid Assessment and Migration Program. At the end of the day, they are all very similar models into approaching cloud adoption, whether or not you're new to the cloud or whether or not you're already fairly established. So I wanted to work through just some of these stages here within the cloud adoption framework to give you maybe a little bit more insight into kind of the goals and objectives of each. So if we go into step one, which is the defined strategy there to the left, the first thing we want to do is focus on our motivations. Why do we want to move to the cloud, or why do we want to move certain workloads to the cloud? And the way that the cloud adoption framework sees this is that they break it into two main sections, which is actually on the first slide that Mike showed. Either, are you doing this for migration purposes, or are you doing this for innovation purposes? And on the migration side, these are often kind of motivations such as cost savings, optimizing internal operations, or maybe just in general trying to increase business agility. Whereas on the innovation side, this is where we're looking to disrupt markets, right? We're looking to provide new services, new capabilities that the cloud can offer us. Next, we have to define the business outcomes. So we want to take those motivations, we want to create ROIs around that. We want to have measurable goals by which we can assess our cloud adoption strategy and ensure that we are actually hitting the goals that we're looking to achieve. These could be fiscal goals, like we said, such as cost savings. These could be goals such as increasing agility. These could be goals in terms of reach. Maybe you want to reach new markets, or you have data sovereignty needs that you want to be able to satisfy. Performance, security, compliance would be others as well. But once you've gone through that process, this is where you can start to map that against projects and prioritize those projects within your organization. So if you have on-prem systems, or if you have a vision for new solutions that you want to build, this is where you want to start to take a look at that and start to think through how do we want to organize this? How do we want to attack these migrations to the cloud? And which ones bubble up as high priorities and dependencies that we want to tackle earlier on, and which ones might be more roadmap items that we would have more of maybe a 1 or 3 year plan for. In step two, we move into planning. And this is really preparing ourselves for going through the migration process. So first, we have to go through an initial organizational alignment. And really, we want to look at those two teams we talked about initially here as kind of our MVP for cloud adoption. That would be the cloud adoption team itself. Those are those DevOps teams and the teams that are really responsible for enabling that environment. But we also want to have the cloud governance team be part of those discussions and on equal footing as well. The whole speed versus control, so that we can make sure that we're attacking both those angles of adoption. Now, once we've established those teams, we want to make sure that we go through a rationalization of our digital estate. We want to take a look at what are our internal apps, our vendor solutions, any kind of supporting solutions we have. What is our current digital estate, either on-prem or in cloud, or maybe third parties? And we want to take a look we want to look through the lens of what they call in the Microsoft adoption framework the 3 Rs. Are there options to rehost certain solutions, more of typical lift shift scenarios? We typically see these as more, minimal change. Maybe you have some older solutions that aren't going to be you're not worried about maybe expanding those into new capabilities, but you do want to, for cost saving purposes, migrate them to the cloud. And there are certainly solutions that fall into that category. We also have the refactoring category. This is where you're maybe making more use of cloud native features, and you're also taking a look at new opportunities for disruptive solutions and disruptive features that you want to bring to market. But then also, finally, there may be solutions here that you can now look at retiring. Maybe cloud has enabled us to either retire certain third-party solutions, or maybe they're just no longer required to be supported by the organization. And you want to go through this exercise so that you can start to get an idea of what that digital state is for your planning purposes in terms of how you're going to move forward. Skills readiness is important. We want to make sure that the organization itself is prepared for the adoption of cloud or even new capabilities that we want to move to cloud. Oftentimes, a tool that companies use is referred to as RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, making sure that you have the right responsibilities in place with the right team members and teams so that you can move quickly through that process without stepping on each other's toes along the way. And then lastly, which is a fairly interesting concept here, is the cloud adoption plan. And really, if you want to think about this, this is really a backlog in the agile or Scrum sense of the word of your cloud adoption path and roadmap. So you're identifying, you're prioritizing your backlog of items. You're identifying any prerequisites. Maybe solution A needs to be deployed before solution B, or maybe networking and monitoring has to be in place before you can do X, Y, or Z. So you're going through that process just like you would with a typical backlog on a typical software development project. You want to review those business rationalizations just like you always have. You want to make sure that you're constantly mapping back to goals and objectives. And you want to go through, and this is an iterative process, right? So we want to go ahead and define, as we would tackle any software project, we want to have iterations and timelines and scope and schedules and things like that for how we plan to move through those migrations. Now, once you've gone through that planning, the next step is to actually prepare the environment. And this first item here, the Azure Setup Guide, is really one of the most important ones here to get you on a good footing. The organization of resources and management hierarchies within your Azure account, it can't be overstated. It's the way that you structure that is going to drive how you implement governance, how you implement access control, how you enforce regulatory compliance, and how you enforce standards within the organization. Some of the cross-cutting cloud operations that we see in here are things such as we talked about before, managing cost analytics, analysis and billing, having structured solution monitoring. How do we enable teams to be able to work effectively within that environment and empower them to do what they need to do? And at the same time, also, how do we have security measures and governance measures in place to make sure that they're adhering, that they're enabled, but still adhering to our corporate standards? Those are all things that will be greatly driven and can either be very challenging or much easier to do based on your account structure. Preparing landing zones. So when you talk about preparing the landing zone, this is preparing the environment by which you are going to either deploy your first Azure environment, or maybe this is a new area that you're diving into. So maybe you haven't worked in big data or AI before in the cloud, and you're starting to step your foot into that, and you're trying to establish yourself in that area. There are going to be certain things that environment is going to have set up that maybe you don't have for some of your previous solutions. So making sure that we have that environment prepared for the workload before actually trying to place that workload in is extremely important. And that includes DevOps enablement as well within that environment. Now, lastly, we have adopt. And really, there's not a whole lot more to say for adopt, as opposed to that this is also an iterative process. So this is where we want to make sure that we're operationalized. It's not just that you're hosting a solution in Azure, but you have visibility into it. You have all your DevOps processes in place. You have teams involved which can help care for that solution and help provide updates and things of that nature. And then, as we said, from that curation and a CoE, make sure that you're actually taking the best practices that you guys have learned and moving that through the chain so that other areas of the organization can benefit from that. Along the bottom here, we see that as a cross-cutting concern to all these stages of first and foremost, we need to be thinking about governance and management. And I think it often gets lumped into governance. I think it could also be a bucket on its own, which would be a cross-cutting concern, which is obviously security, right? All those things as you're going through planning and ready and adoption need to be considered as you're moving through. Next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Norma. So when we talk about governance, Azure provides a number of controls. Mike touched upon some of them, and I want to dive deeper just into a few. One of the first ones is RBAC, role-based access control. This provides configurable permissions within to Azure resources at different levels of your account structure, and that's an important concept when we say at different levels. So we're going to look in the next slide at actual account structures in some way that maybe strategically organizations can look at those. But we do have these things called management groups. Management groups provide a means of establishing hierarchical controls that can then be inherited by either lower subscriptions or lower resources. We also can grant permissions there. So if we have a management group which has 5 subscriptions under it, we can grant particular permissions at that management group level, and they're just by inference inherited by those child subscriptions and child resources within those subscriptions. We can also provide, and really, and I'll just say one more thing on the management groups there. Really, when we're talking about those governance controls at the management group level, we're looking at management groups in that regard because we know that we want to be able to share that across multiple subscriptions and multiple environments. Now, we can also apply these same kind of controls at the subscription level. When we look at RBAC at the subscription level, where we see a lot of success is when companies start to look at subscriptions as boundaries for DevOps teams. And we start to see those as being able to enable those teams to have the permissions they need to self-service and self-manage within that subscription. So not having to go into an area where we have a flat subscription structure and we have individuals which has to be granted individual permissions for either resources or resource groups, and they have to go through a central hierarchy for that to make sure they don't butt heads with other resources or resource groups in that same subscription. By carving out subscriptions for DevOps teams where they can self-serve, you can actually start to feel comfortable with the appropriate governance controls in place to grant them owner access within that subscription so that they can self-manage and that they don't have to fear a very sprawled permission structure which has to go through a central governing body. And then resource groups and resources. You can get down at that level, obviously, to start looking at specific permissions. I would argue that you want to make sure that you have a good reason for starting to apply very specific permissions for things beyond the subscription level if you're going to go that route, just because, again, of the potential sprawl that could entail. Examples of RBAC, there's numbers of built-in RBACs, and you can create custom roles within Azure as well. But some of the more prevalent ones, owner permissions, which allow you to not only add resources within that Azure scope, but also assign RBAC within that scope as well. Contributor is the same, only you just don't have the permissions to do the RBAC side. You can only deploy resources. Storage blob data reader, security administrator, cost management administrator. These are all different levels of granular permissions that give different access within this environment, and they're all tied back to your Azure AD. Some examples of things that we see out there, obviously DevOps teams, obviously in lower environments such as dev and maybe test, they oftentimes want to be granted contributor access so they can have the flexibility to debug and troubleshoot. Typically, we would not give that access in prod. Typically, what we would do in prod is we would give them privileged identity management access so that they're making those requests as needed. Let's say you have a data lake and you're looking to have users who aren't necessarily responsible for managing the Azure environment and they're not worried about deployments, but they need to be able to read data out of that data lake. That's a perfect opportunity to employ the storage blob data reader permissions for those users so that they have the minimal access they need to do their job. And we, like I said, we have cost manager reader permissions and contributor. Those are the kind of permissions that necessarily you don't have permission to go through and make changes in the Azure environment, but you can start to look at cost and billing. And what we want to try to do is, as we have those races and we have those different teams and different DevOps teams, we want to try to map, and this is just a small sampling, we want to try to map those roles to the right people. Security administrator being another great one. Oftentimes we have security teams that are responsible for the overall security posture. We want to give them security admin rights so that they can do their job effectively. Policies are another great side and powerful area within Azure where this is where you can start to move away from that centralized governance body, which all decisions have to go through, and you can automate that and you can put that on Rails. So this is where we can actually codify our guardrails within Azure to make sure that we're meeting compliance. There are general, and there's literally hundreds of these, or you, again, can make your own. Out of the box, though, there are hundreds. And there are very general ones. Maybe you want to require certain tags for chargeback scenarios. Maybe you only want to allow resources to be deployed to certain regions if you have data sovereignty scenarios for certain solutions. We also have resource-specific ones, requiring MFA or requiring TDE on Azure SQL databases, disabling management ports on VMs, or requiring just-in-time management port access on VMs, requiring HTTPS on app services. The list goes on, and you can map a lot of these to specific resources, whether or not it's Kubernetes services, Azure SQL Database, Cosmos, VMs, or more infrastructure, networking. There's a set of these that you can employ across all those to make sure that you're hitting the right notes in terms of your governance needs. And any of these policies that you apply, you have different options there. One option would be to enforce individual policies as deny, so that you basically will not allow someone to deploy something if they indeed are not meeting a policy. So if I try to deploy an Azure SQL database, but I don't have advanced threat protection enabled, we just say, nope, sorry, you can't do that. And here's why, because for our policy here at our organization that you must have advanced threat protection on all Azure SQL databases within this scope of the Azure environment. You can also set them up as audits. So if you want to have maybe a less rigid model for some areas that aren't as critical, but you want to have visibility into when these things are happening, you can have an audit policy, which means that the team will be notified that policy and for a certain area has not been conformed to, and then you can make a decision on whether or not that's something that the team wants to follow up on to get justification for it. And you can even have policies which will deploy artifacts that they don't already exist. Oftentimes we employ that for things like tagging. If you want to make sure that you always have particular tags for chargeback scenarios, rather than just doing a deny if that tag doesn't exist, based on your organizational account structure, you can set up deploy if not exist policies, which will go ahead and just on your behalf, based on where you're deploying it, will actually add those tags. And another tool that brings all these things together is Azure Blueprints. So Azure Blueprints provides a means of defining a repeatable set of Azure resources and governance controls to be deployed across the environment. So this includes policies, RBAC, resource groups, and resources themselves. So this gives you a repeatable deployment unit that you can use to match up with your organizational needs. And it's also important to note that Azure has a large set of government regulatory based blueprints, which they've already created on our behalf. So whether or not you have HIPAA high trust concerns or FedRAMP or PCI or NIST, these are all blueprints that already exist today that already have the policies baked in them to map up with those control mappings that those regulatory compliance needs need to adhere to. And of course, you can always roll your own blueprints as well. Next slide, please, Norma. So this is I think, an important slide, and this is something which we see sometimes get overlooked, especially on initial cloud adoption, and it's the account structure. Because again, as I said earlier, this is really going to drive how you organize your governance and your enablement across the entire environment. So the proper account structure can, if you can figure out your proper account structure, can greatly simplify the governance and cloud enablement within the organization. As an example, oftentimes we see some organizations have a very flat subscription structure. Maybe they have a dev test subscription and a prod subscription. And that works okay under some scenarios, but as you start to grow, that can start to become very challenging to manage, really, from a sprawl perspective. What if you have solutions that are both that require, maybe you have some solutions in prod that require PCI compliance, but some that don't. Well, there's different policies then that need to be dictated in terms of what you can do within that subscription for those different solutions. What if you have public-facing solutions versus internal solutions? There's probably different policies and access rights that you want to apply there. What if you have the autonomous deployment or autonomous development teams? If you have just a single subscription structure, it's hard to hand over the keys to be able to do what they need to do. That's again where a situation where, since you only have a single subscription, there has to be kind of someone overseeing that subscription, which is able to delegate rights on a resource or resource by resource group perspective. So it's important to start to think about that. And really the key thing that we see is to take a look at your IT organization and the types of solutions that you have in your digital estate, and start to map out your account structure based on that. And when I say your IT organization, I really am meaning your IT organization. I do not mean, and this is a fallacy which sometimes organizations fall into. They say, well, organizationally, overall, we have a finance team, we have an accounting team, we have, a procurement team, and sometimes we see people starting to create a finance management group, a accounting management group, a procurement management group. That's not really the way to tackle it, because what we're trying to do here is have a hierarchical model by which we can apply policies and RBAC so that can flow down to the appropriate areas where we're going to be hosting those solutions. So looking at it from the IT organization perspective oftentimes makes a lot more sense. So if you have solutions which require high trust or HIPAA compliance needs, maybe you have a management group that's dedicated to hosting subscriptions which are going to be geared towards high trust scenarios. And then at that management group level, you can apply all your high trust policies, or maybe the Azure Blueprint that deals with HIPAA, and that will just automatically filter down to all those subscriptions. A couple things to note. Like I said, don't just mimic your organizational structure. That can lead to a challenging environment to manage over time. Subscriptions, one piece of advice that we typically have if organizations can do it is to configure them for centralized oversight, but for decentralized management, right? So what that means there is that those involved and responsible for the entire cloud environment, they should have visibility into all these subscriptions that we want to stand up in this model, where you're standing up more subscriptions, maybe for solution specific or DevOps team specific needs. But we also want to decentralize the management of those subscriptions to those DevOps teams themselves. They shouldn't have to go to a central authority every single time they need to add a new team member or as they need new permissions. They should be given the rights to manage that themselves with that centralized oversight so that everyone has visibility into what's going on. And like we said before, subscriptions should definitely mirror the organization's DevOps and IT structure. And this is just following Conway's law, which is a very important thing for us to look at, not just here, but also for our DevOps practices as well. Next slide, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks. And these last couple slides, I just want to touch upon because I definitely want to get to Sandy so we can talk to you more about some of our case studies as well as how we approach these with customers. But Security Center is a tool which really all organizations should be employing at the highest extent. This is the environment where security administrators can start to manage the overall security posture within the organization. It provides opportunities for policy enforcement and auditing, and also remediation. There are other tools as well that can kind of fall under similar buckets, such as Azure Sentinel. But this is really, if you think about the portal for those security admins, where they can start to manage that security posture. If you go to the next slide. Azure Enterprise Monitoring. I'm not going to talk a ton on this slide, but the important thing to note here is that we have two areas that we need to consider, or maybe multiple, but what I'll mention here is two areas that we should be considering when we're looking at monitoring. We should be considering those individuals and the needs of monitoring for those that are responsible for the overall cloud environment. And we should also be very cognizant of having a solution that works for those specific DevOps teams. When we talk about those that are responsible for managing the overall Azure environment, they're going to want to know things like what's the spend, how much are these things costing us, are there cost optimizations that we can make, are there security issues that we need to address, do we have policy nonconformance in certain areas, are there service outages across Azure that we need to be aware of. Those are all things that using subscription activity logs and bubbling that up to that operations team, we can give them visibility into that overall health of the Azure environment and usage of the environment. But those DevOps teams are equally important. Those responsible for actually managing the health of specific solutions within the Azure environment typically need not only that information, but they also need more granular information. Are my data factory pipelines failing? Do I have errors in my logic apps? Am I receiving a lot of 404s or 500 errors in my app services that I'm hosting? There's where we want to have more specific diagnostic logs that can ship out to their log analytics workspaces so that they can get very detailed in their analysis of potential issues or just knowing how their systems are operating. Next slide, please. And then finally, cost management. I'm guessing a lot of people on the call are familiar with cost management in Azure. One of the nice things is based on if you have a structured account structure in Azure, a lot of these things just kind of fall into line. But oftentimes another similar strategy along with that is to tag things in an appropriate way. What cost management will do, if you're not familiar or aware of it, is it's a portal where people can self-service cost analytics for areas that they have access to, and they can also do actual budgeting within those environments as well and get budget threshold alerts if they see themselves starting to inch up towards something that might be, that might be of concern to them. And again, there are specific roles here that we can employ. So if we actually have an area of our organizational account structure which is dedicated to, let's say, I don't know, a specific DevOps group or a specific compliance need, you can actually budget directly off of that by having cost administrators just defined in those management groups, or you can have higher level ones as well that have visibility across everything. But the important thing there is that you're scoped to only be able to budget and see cost analytics on what you actually have access to. So that's pretty much it for me. Hopefully this was somewhat informative. I want to do now is kick it off to Sandy so we can talk about some of the work we've done in this space and kind of how we approach it with customers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mike and Norma. Let's have a little quick talk about a case study, and maybe it can be applicable to you all. So our CEI team of Steve Jancy, Jeff Tewksbury, of course, and Jason Agostoni, Richard Goforth, Derek Sademeyer, worked in support of with the Microsoft team and a large manufacturing company that designs, develops arc welding products, which I think is kind of unique. The use case was creating a standardized Azure, and as Jeff said, a DevOps platform that would enable applications, and as it says here, organized, secure, fashion for now and the future. The CEI team worked in conjunction with our client to formalize an Azure account structure, controls, some policies, where the assignments would be, so that they could create this framework of the Cloud Center of Excellence. And also it created a future roadmap for the future for them. Next slide, please. So the CEI team continues to collaborate with the client in this whole Cloud Center of Excellence journey. We believe it's going to create a positive impact throughout the enterprise. So the question is now, how do we help you? How do we take what we've done from a successful discussion points that Mike and Jeff have talked about, and how do we apply that to your environment? So what we've done is we've put together a 5-day assessment, and this can be modified to fit your needs. But before we even started in our assessment with the client, we received support and helped top management to position this with the CEO of the company. So we need consensus, we need leadership, we need buy-in, and we received that from the CEO. Then we started day one, and what we did was review their current environment, their organizational structure, their security, their usage, their knowledge of DevOps and where they are from a DevOps maturity perspective, and discuss the success criteria and overall goals of Cloud Center of Excellence for that company. Then on day 2, we assessed the opportunities and we asked ourselves these questions. What are the key areas for creating best practices for the company? What blueprints are going to be needed? How do we optimize costs and take advantage of costs? And are those costs going to be efficient for us? Day 3, we love workshops, right? We had a workshop approach to discuss the particular governance tools, the best practices that would fit the direction of the company, specifically the cloud direction. And we also said, are we going to get a return on investment by creating this framework? Day 4, we developed some insights. We documented findings. We provide this closed loop feedback. We develop a rollout approach on governance and training for the company. So now the company's starting to buy in, right? And day 5, of course, we have the roadmap approach where we walk through and validate the assessment and the rollout program for the company. So it's a 5-day assessment. It's a quick start. We think it creates a framework for any company in any industry that can be able to create a successful application framework for the future. Next slide, please. So that's our 5-day. A little stat and fact about us, I'm sure you guys know, and I'll go through this quickly, is we're located in Pittsburgh. We have a ton of support facilities on the East Coast. We go out to Denver. We're certified in cloud, app modernization, data and analytics, and we have the certifications, and we've done over 2,500 projects from a CEI perspective. So please challenge us in that area. We were Supplier of the Year from a diversification perspective in 2015 and 2019, and we're up for Diversity Supplier of the Year from a national perspective. Next slide, please. So you just heard quickly about the Azure CoE 5-day assessment. We can also help you out from an ad hoc perspective on specific projects. And then we can also do an end-to-end establishment of your Cloud Center of Excellence. My request to you, and I do this in all our webinars, is to challenge our team. And we're up for the challenge in creating this Cloud Center of Excellence. In my opinion, will be the baseline of success for you and your company as you go through this cloud journey. We talked about the 5-day assessment, and with this 5-day assessment, I forgot to note that we're moving AWS applications to the Azure environment. Our expertise from an AWS perspective and our expertise from an from an Azure cloud perspective. Also, we can shape a POC based on your cloud strategy and test these government descriptions that we talked about in your current environment. Our intent, this is our intent, is to be able to create a collaboration between CEI and yourself, and also to be able to create a trust relationship so that we can have this secure framework for your cloud transformation journey. What I do is I invite you to call me or call your sales leader in your particular geography, and we can discuss next steps to get you started. Norma, back to you.
Great, thank you. But we are pretty much at the top of our time, so we'd like to just go ahead and wrap up. I don't see that we have any questions, but of course, if you do, please reach out to Sandy or to any of our presenters today. We'd like to appreciate everyone's time for joining us today. We hope you found the content valuable. Just real quickly, we have one more webinar in our series left. It's August 27th, and it's about automating work with robotic process automation. So hope we can join us for that. As follow-up, we will send you an email with the link to the recording for today's webinar, and we will also include a registration link for our next webinar. Thank you again to our wonderful presenters, and if you are ready to get started on building a cloud center of excellence, please reach out to Sandy or the CI account executive who invited you today. We hope you have a great afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.